Caleb Boone lived alone on a windswept stretch of New Mexico territory where the land was as silent as the man who worked it. It was 1874, and the desert sun spared no mercy for the living or the dead. The hills rolled in rust-colored waves, broken only by twisted pines and the occasional buzzards circling overhead. His ranch was little more than a squat log house, a weathered barn, and an old corral kept standing by sheer stubbornness. It wasn't much, but it was his, and it was quiet just the way he liked it. At 29, Caleb was already something of a legend in town. They called him St. Boone, not kindly, but not quite cruelly either. A name born of whiskey-stained sarcasm from saloon mouths who didn't trust a man who didn't drink. He never joined the poker tables, never took a girl upstairs at the brothel, and never stayed past sundown in town unless he had to. He'd come in once every few weeks by feed, tobacco, a little flour, and coffee and ride back out with hardly a word. The preacher's son, they whispered. Too holy for the likes of us. But Caleb's silence wasn't piety, it was fear, not of death, not of blood, but of people, of touch, of the unpredictable warmth of another soul, especially women. He had never so much as kissed one. Not because he didn't want to. God knew he'd felt the longing, the ache of it burning through lonely nights under cold stars. But his upbringing had carved a trench between him and the idea of closeness. His father had been a preacher with a Bible in one hand and a belt in the other. A woman's touch is a test, the man would say, always with fire in his eyes. Their temptation in a skirt, son, sweet on the outside, poison underneath. Caleb's mother had died when he was 15, consumed by a fever no doctor could stop and no prayer could heal. After that, the old man only grew harder. The ranch became less of a home and more of a pulpit for punishment and isolation. By the time Caleb was old enough to leave, he didn't know how to talk to anyone anymore, especially not women, especially not when they smiled. So he stayed out here, where the wind didn't ask anything of him and the horses didn't care who he used to be. He kept to routine: rise before dawn, feed the stock, mend the fence, ride the land. Sometimes he'd sit by the creek at sunset, watching the sky turn copper and ash. And sometimes, when the loneliness pressed in hard, he'd hum an old lullaby his mother used to sing, the words half forgotten but the tune still clear in his chest. He had everything he needed: a good horse, strong hands, silence. Or, so he told himself. That spring, the rains came late. The ground cracked open under the sun's fist, and the cattle grew thin. Caleb worked longer hours, riding farther out to find grass and water. It was on one of these long rides miles from his ranch, near the edge of a canyon, that he saw something strange, a flicker of movement in the rocks. Something or someone watching. He turned his horse slowly, scanning the ridge. Nothing, just wind and stone. But the feeling lingered. A quiet charge in the air, like eyes on his back. He didn't know it then, but the winds were shifting. And before the week was out, a woman's touch, the very thing he'd spent his whole life avoiding, would find him in the most unexpected way. Not with seduction, but with a simple, quiet question: may I ride with you? She appeared like a ghost out of the desert. That it was near sundown when Caleb Boone saw her, again half hidden behind a cluster of mesquite trees near the canyon trail. He'd been riding the outer edge of his land, searching for strays, when the wind shifted and carried the faintest sound, a whisper of breath, maybe a footfall in dry dirt. He turned in his saddle slowly, every muscle taut, and there she was, a girl, perhaps 18 or 19, slender and sun-darkened, watching him with eyes as sharp and still as a hawk's. Her long black hair hung in thick, wind-tangled braids. She wore buckskin clothing, patched and torn, with feathers woven into the fabric. Her face was streaked with dust, and her lips looked cracked from thirst, but she didn't look afraid. She looked ready to boltor, ready to fight. Caleb didn't move. He'd seen Apache before, Mosley warriors, passing distant through the hills. But this girl was alone. No horse, no weapon he could see. Just those fierce eyes and the silence between them. Are you lost? He asked quietly. She didn't answer. He dismounted slowly, raising his hands just a little to show he wasn't a threat. The girl flinched, but didn't run. You hungry? He asked next. Still no reply, but her gaze shifted to his saddlebag. Caleb took out a strip of jerky and tossed it near her feet. She hesitated, then knelt quickly and snatched it up, chewing like someone who hadn't eaten in days. He watched her carefully. Her ribs showed beneath the buckskin. Her hands were scraped raw. Someone or something had done her harm. When she was done, she looked up at him again, the fierceness replaced by something more guarded, wary, but not hostile. Where's your people? He asked, to pause, then a quiet, halting word. Gone. It was the only thing she said that night. Caleb didn't push. He offered her water from his canteen, then gestured toward his horse. You'll freeze out here come nightfall. She looked at the horse, looked at him. Then, to his quiet amazement, she nodded. She rode behind him the whole way home, her small hands gripping the saddle's edge, her body pressed lightly against his back. It was the first time Caleb Boone had ever felt a woman's touch, and it nearly stopped his heart. Not because it was sinful or sensual, but because it was real, soft, warm, human. He couldn't think straight the whole ride back. At the ranch, He gave her the barn loft to sleep in and left food and blankets without a word. She still hadn't told him her name. She still didn't trust him, but she didn't run. Over the next few days, she remained silent, shadow-like. She didn't speak unless spoken to, and even then, only in one-word replies. But she watched him, always watching. When he chopped wood, when he worked the corral, when he read from his battered Bible by firelight. She watched with eyes that didn't blink much, like she was learning him piece by piece. Then, on the fourth morning, just after sunrise, she appeared beside him at the stable while he saddled his horse. She pointed at the animal, then at herself, and in a voice that was soft but sure, she said, "Teach me." Caleb stared at her, unsure he'd heard right. "Teach me horse," she repeated. It was the first time she'd asked him for anything. He nodded slowly. That morning, she rode with him again, not just to survive, but by choice. He still didn't know her name, but something in her voice, something in the way she sat behind him without fear told him she had begun to trust him, and that was a dangerous, beautiful thing. Spring came to the desert, slow, but steady, like a breath held too long and finally released. The wind lost some of its bite, and the mornings brought a soft light instead of frost. Caleb Boone began to see the land differently now, not just as a place to survive, but as a place where something might grow, and it had started with her. He learned her name that week, Neola. She said it, simply, one evening, by the fire, sitting cross-legged across from him while they shared beans from a pot. When he asked what it meant, she hesitated, then replied, "Wind that dances." Caleb wasn't sure what to say, so he just nodded and said, "Fits you." She smiled for the first time. They spent every morning in the pasture, working with the horses. Neola was a natural, light-handed, graceful, patient, but she lacked experience, especially with skittish or broken animals. So Caleb taught her the way his mother had taught him: soft tones, slow movement, never force, always listening. It started with her riding double, him behind her, guiding her posture with his hands, speaking just above her ear. Those first rides were torture in a way he couldn't name. Her hair brushed his cheek. Her back leaned against his chest. Her hands, calloused and small, rested on the reins, but his covered hers. He tried not to think about how it felt, about the heat in his chest or the tremble in his fingers. Neola, for her part, said nothing, but he saw how she'd sometimes glance back at him, not timid, but curious, as if she, too, was wondering what all this closeness meant. One afternoon, after a long ride through the lower hills, they stopped by the river. Neola slipped off the saddle and waded into the water, splashing her face, laughing when it hit her boots. Caleb sat on the bank, watching her in a daze. She looked different in the light, less like a stranger and more like someone he'd always known. When she came out of the river, dripping and smiling, she walked over to where he sat and, without asking, reached down and drew a red streak across his cheek with her thumb, dipping into some mud and berry pulp she carried in a small pouch. He froze. "Apache paint," she said. "Now you are warrior." Caleb stared at her, heat rising in his chest. Her hand lingered on his face. He didn't move, couldn't. Then she pulled away and sat beside him, arms around her knees, face turned toward the sunset. They didn't speak for a while. Later that night, back at the ranch, she sang, softly, like wind through pine needles. Caleb didn't understand the words, but the sound of her voice settled deep into him, like roots finding soil after a long drought. He sat still as stone, afraid to breathe, afraid he'd break the spell. When she finished, he whispered, "That was beautiful." She looked at him with something unreadable in her eyes, then said quietly, "You are kind." Caleb Boone. He didn't know how to respond. He'd spent his whole life hiding from women, from desire, from touch. Now, here was one sitting across from him in the firelight, not asking anything from him except to be near, and somehow, that made him want to give her everything. Still, he held back. He didn't try to kiss her, didn't reach for her hand. He simply nodded and whispered, "Thank you." But in his heart, a gate had opened, and something wild and unfamiliar was galloping through it. Love wasn't a thunderclap. He was learning. Sometimes, it came on a slow ride with a woman named Wind. It was the kind of morning where the sky felt too quiet. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows over the sand-colored hills. When Caleb Boone saw the riders on the horizon, 5 of them, spread wide like a hunting line, dust curled behind their horses in lazy spirals. They weren't from town. He knew the look of bounty hunters, hard men with rifles strapped to their saddles and greed behind their eyes. Caleb watched from the porch, shotgun across his lap. Neola stood just inside the cabin door. She saw them too, and he felt her body stiffen. Her eyes narrowed, not with fear, but something colder. Memory, maybe. Wounds that hadn't scarred over. "They come for me," she said quietly. Caleb didn't answer. He already knew. The men rode in slow, like they owned the dirt beneath them. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a beard, the color of wet ash, tipped his hat as he dismounted. "Morning," he said. "Name's Judd Mather." "You, Caleb Boone." Caleb stood. "Depends," Mather smirked. "We're tracking a fugitive. Apache girl. Name Esneo. Word is, she ran from her tribe, some kind of marriage dispute. They put a bounty on her. Seems her kin want her back." She's no criminal, Caleb said. She's under my roof. Well now, Mather said, taking a slow step forward. Ain't that sweet? But the bounty doesn't care where she sleeps or who's got her under what roof. There's money on her head, and that's all my boys need to hear. Caleb's jaw clenched. Not today. Mather's smile didn't reach his eyes. We ain't here to shoot you, Boone, but you step in our way. We'll bury you and let the coyotes handle the rest. Behind him, the other men chuckled. Rough laughter. The kind that always came before violence. Then a new voice cut through the air sharp. Sure, she is not yours, Neola said, stepping out onto the porch. Every eye turned to her. The wind pulled at her braids, and the sunlight glinted off the beads in her shirt. She didn't flinch. She stood tall, her hands empty, but her presence like a drawn blade. I choose where I go, she said, loud enough for all to hear, and I choose here. Judd Mather tilted his head. Well, you got fire, girl, I'll give you that, but choosing don't mean much when you're being sold. He nodded once to his men. And just like that, the air snapped. Guns came out. Caleb moved faster than he ever had. He raised the shotgun, stepping in front of her, eyes locked on Mather. You come back here again, he said, voice like gravel. And you'll leave in a pine box. Mather stared at him, weighing the odds. Then, after a long pause, he gave a mocking little bow. We'll be back, preacher's son, he said. And next time, we won't ask so nicely. The riders turned and left. But their dust hung in the air long after they vanished. That night, Caleb didn't sleep. Neither did Neil. They sat on the porch in silence, the shotgun between them. She reached over once, fingers brushing his just lightly. I will go, she said. You are kind. I won't let them kill you. You're not going anywhere, Caleb said. She looked at him, surprised. He met her eyes. I've lived with fear my whole life. I'm done letting it make my choices. She reached for his hand again, but this time she didn't let go. The storm was coming, but they would ride into it together. The sun had barely slipped beneath the horizon when Caleb Marlowe first heard the faint rustle coming from the dry grass beyond his fence. His worn leather boots crunched softly against the dirt path as he stepped outside, eyes scanning the vast expanse of his ranch under the deepening twilight. Caleb was a man shaped by solitude and silence. Years ago, he had left behind the bustling towns and their clamorous saloons, choosing instead the lonely life of a rancher in the unforgiving wilds of the western frontier. His only companions were the cattle grazing across his land and the wind whispering through the sagebrush. But tonight, something was different. A sharp cry pierced the quiet, a woman's voice caught in pain. Without hesitation, Caleb grabbed his rifle, its worn wood familiar beneath his calloused hands, and moved cautiously toward the sound. In the low brush, barely visible against the fading light, he saw her, a young native woman, her clothes torn, a deep wound on her side bleeding steadily. Her dark hair was tangled with dirt and blood, her eyes fierce yet flickering with exhaustion. He knelt beside her, feeling the weight of the moment. Hold on, he said gently, pulling his bandana free and pressing it against the gash. The girl, whose name he would later learn was Neola, gritted her teeth but did not resist. Caleb's hands were steady as he tore strips from his shirt to bind her wound, his mind racing. He knew the danger she could bring. Stories of settlers and natives clashing were common, but something in her gaze told him she was not an enemy. Why are you here? He asked quietly. Neola's voice was low and strained. Hunted my people. Before he could ask more, the distant sound of shouting and hoofbeats echoed over the hills. Caleb's heart pounded. He helped her to her feet, guiding her back to the safety of his ranch house. That night, he tended to her injuries as best he could, using every bit of knowledge he'd learned in his isolated years. They shared no words beyond what was necessary, but a fragile trust began to grow in the dim candlelight. Morning broke with a harsh chill. Caleb woke to an eerie silence. No birdsong, no wind, just the faint creak of the ranch settling in the cold air. He stepped outside to check on the horses, but what he saw froze him in place. On the ridge overlooking his land, a line of figures stood tall, dark silhouettes against the brightening sky. Warriors, hundreds of them, had come, their faces painted, weapons ready. Their eyes fixed on his ranch. Neola appeared behind him, steady and resolute despite the pain in her eyes. They have come for me, she said softly, but not to fight. Caleb tightened his grip on his rifle. Then why are they here? She turned, gaze piercing. To protect, to see the man who saved their sister. What follows is a story of unlikely alliances, fierce loyalty, and a battle that would test the limits of both men and warriors. The sun rose high over the scarred earth, painting the sky a fiery orange as Caleb Boone stirred beneath the shade of the old pine tree outside his cabin. His body ached, every movement a reminder of the wounds he'd barely survived. But the pain was softened by the warmth of Neola's hand, resting in his cave, a quiet anchor against the storm inside him. The battle was behind them, but its shadow lingered. The bounty hunters were gone, driven off or dead, but the danger had not vanished. If they stayed here, it was only a matter of time before another band came riding. Thirsty for gold or revenge, Neola looked down at him, her dark eyes steady and clear. "We cannot stay," she said softly. "They will come again. This land is not safe for either of us." Caleb nodded, swallowing the stubborn pride that had kept him locked in solitude for so long. "Then we ride." Together, they packed what little they had: Caleb's shotgun, Neola's bow, a few blankets, and a handful of provisions. Neither spoke much as they prepared. Words felt unnecessary between them now. Their bond had been forged in fire and blood, and it needed no declaration. When they finally mounted, Caleb's strength, still fragile, Neola took the lead, guiding their horse along the narrow trail winding through the desert. The land stretched endlessly around them: vast mesas, jagged cliffs, an endless sky. It was both beautiful and cruel, a world where survival meant toughness and luck. But for the first time in his life, Caleb felt something else: hope. As the miles slipped beneath their hooves, they spoke of things neither had dared admit before: dreams of a home built together, of peace and belonging. Neola told stories of her people, of the wind and the stars and the fierce love that bound them to the land. Caleb shared memories of his father's sermons, of quiet prayers whispered in the dark, of a longing he never fully understood. They were an unlikely pair, one shaped by faith and fear, the other by tradition and fire. Yet in each other, they found a kind of grace. At night, beneath a blanket of stars, Neola rested her head against Caleb's shoulder, and he felt the steady beat of her heart, a rhythm that spoke of life, resilience, and love. The ride was long and hard. They faced scorching days and freezing nights, wild animals, and the ever-present threat of men who hunted for bounties, or worse. But together, they were stronger. Together, they would find a new path. One evening, as they crested a ridge and looked out over a lush valley dotted with cottonwoods and clear water, Caleb pulled Neola close. "This can be our home," he said, "a place where no one will chase us, where we can be free." She smiled, the kind of smile that held both sorrow and promise. "Then let's ride there," she whispered. Together, and so they did. The lonely man and the Apache girl, bound by courage and choice, rode beyond fear, beyond the past, into a future neither could have imagined alone. The land stretched wide before them, and the wind like a dancer whispered their names. Caleb, Boone, and Neola were no longer just survivors, they were family.